Hello to you all, my name is John O'Keefe. As you can see, I'm just going to talk to you for maybe, 30 minutes max about criminology and forensic psychology on the basis that there's no such thing as a free lunch. I'll be mentioning something you can do at the end of it as well, which you're going to need for that bit. But just to give you an overview of what I cover, not just in city colleges, but in other institutions I happen to deal with. So, criminology and forensic psychology, unusual to have these two terms mentioned together. Normally you'll hear about criminologists or you'll hear about forensic psychologists, but criminology and forensic psychology perhaps gives us the best of both worlds. It gives us criminology, which is the scientific study of crime, and it gives us forensic psychology, which is the study of bad men. And I do say men, that's not to say that there aren't women who aren't bad, but in terms of forensic application, and in terms of the prison system, for example, I'm afraid women, you're very poorly represented, and shame on you. But the men, of course, are highly represented and seems to have a great fascination with committing the most evil of crimes. But anyway, we might just touch on that in a moment. So as you can see, I happen to be a bit of both. I happen to be a magistrate in England, so I suppose I see it from the other side as well. People who come before you in the legal sense as opposed to into the psychological or criminological sense. General topics. So these are the sort of. Let's go there. Is that gone? That's fine. Okay. And these are the type of topics you can expect to come across for those of you who may decide to study criminology and/or forensic psychology. Let me just mention a couple of things first. First thing that we tend to talk about when we're looking at the forensic psychology side of things is personality disorders. Now, the difficulty with crime is you tend to get two groups of people. You get people who imagine it's all societal, environmental and familial driven, and they tend to be called sociologists and have long hair and live in UCD. And then you get the other ones who are psychologists, who I'm not quite sure what length the hair is, and I'm not bitter, by the way, I can bring it up. And they tend to obviously just approach it from a singular psychological perspective. The reality is, of course, it takes both, and that's what I'm going to try and give you a breakdown of. The first thing I want to mention is something that isn't mentioned a lot, and if it is mentioned, tends to be mentioned in passing rather than anything else. But really, it's hugely important, certainly when it comes to criminals that I've dealt with over the years, and indeed some of the people who supposedly look after the criminals, and that's the idea of personality disorders. So the first question we tend to ask ourselves in forensic psychology is what is a personality disorder? And quite simply, it is an issue whereby you have difficulty living with yourself and or other people, and you consistently make and repeat the same mistakes all over and over again. Now, of course, you might say, well, I'm living with one of them, he's called a husband. Well, he probably doesn't fall into this category. Obviously, we all make mistakes from time to time, but generally speaking, we learn from them. Not always, but some of the time. And generally speaking, we can live with ourselves or others. So these people with personality disorders reckoned to be about 1 in 10 of the population. So a significant figure, but nonetheless almost entirely undiagnosed. Few people are going to go to their GP and say, I'd like a referral to a psychiatrist or a psychologist because I just don't have any empathy with anyone. You're probably not going to say that. The fact that you've no empathy means you're not going to your doctor anyway. But in any event, personality disorders tend to be broken up into three groups. Suspicious, emotional and anxious. Now, in terms of crime, those people who are suffering, and I do put that in quotes, from suspicious or anxious personality disorders don't tend to come to the attention of people like myself or police forces or the prison system by virtue of definition, really, because they are suspicious and anxious. They're too busy with other things, quite frankly, to be out there committing crime. But certainly when it comes to emotional and impulsive personality disorders, we're going to briefly mention two today, which is narcissism and psychopathy. When it comes to these two things particularly, any general prison population will be full, and I mean full. So when we're looking at personality disorders generally, it is estimated that 80% plus of any given prison population will be personality disordered, and I'm talking about the prison population now, not the prison officers. And of that 80%, perhaps half or even more, 40 or 50%, will suffer from antisocial personality disorder, or what we know to mean psychopathy in day-to-day lingo. The dark triad of personalities are interesting. I'll just mention those briefly to you. as I go through this. And these are the ones that are interesting from a crime perspective. Now, if we just look at narcissism first, there's a thing which is a kind of a thing of my creation, really, the ordinary, decent narcissist. Again, we're almost exclusively, for today's purposes in any event, talking about men. That's not to say women can't be narcissistic or psychopathic, they can, but it tends to be very few. Ordinary, decent narcissism. So these are people who are not falling into personality disorder categories. There might be men, I mean, I can't judge, maybe men with a whiff of sulfur about them. Something just a little bit different, a little bit dangerous, but nothing you couldn't control. For example, in a relationship. So for some reason, I put my own picture down there of a couple of years ago, bottom left. I'll leave it up to you to decide where I might fall. Narcissistic personality disorder. Who better to pick than Kim Kardashian? A picture in the middle there. I mean, if she's not suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder, what a waste. Because really, she must be, and if she wasn't, she certainly probably would be now. And then on the right, what's known as malignant or Machiavellian narcissism. I put two political figures there. Mr. Johnson, you'll know, maybe less familiar with Dominic Cummings, who is his spin doctor. You may have heard about him in the media. And really, that's not a very flattering photograph of both of them. It's obviously ideal for this lecture. But politicians are often accused of having malignant or Machiavellian narcissism. In other words, they have all the traits of psychopathy, bar occasional, and I do mean occasional, signs of remorse and empathy. But that's a lecture for another day. Psychopathy, of course, by the way, just so we get this into perspective, we are talking about a very small percentage of the population. Now, the people I deal with, you know, it's all about, yeah, man's a psycho, he's a psycho, I'm a psycho. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking everybody wasn't a psycho. But the reality is, in the general population, so not the prison population, but the general population, you're looking at about 1 to 2% who could be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is the psychiatric criterion name for it. Now, look, I've got two people on there again who I have to say, if they're not suffering, if I can call it suffering from psychopathy, God help us. But there are various pictures. You know enough about them. That's another lecture, and we might come back to that again. But I'd ask you today to, not in a kind of, just to frighten you, I don't think you can be, but beware of the ordinary, decent psychopath. This particular chap might certainly come across as, there's nobody old enough here to remember Steptoe and Son. He looks a little bit like the father in that. Yeah, nobody's nodding. Okay. He looks like a fairly amiable, if slightly hangdog look of a grandfather, but in fact, his name is Albert Fish. It's believed he may have killed up to 100 children or indeed beyond, we're not sure. And his famous catchphrase was, I like children, they're tasty. So I think, optics can be a little bit deceiving, can't they? John Wayne Gacy, who some of you who are frankly too fascinated with serial killers and may stay up late at night to watch programs on them will be aware of his famous phrase, which was that he was simply running a license without a cemetery. And I mean, in many respects, this is what sexual serial killers, and by the way, they are all sexual, either overtly or covertly, this is what they all believe, that they are entitled to take life as and when they please. Close to home in more recent times, you will be familiar with the 2015 case of Graham Dwyer. That's a picture of Graham Dwyer on the Late Late Show 2 months after he murdered Elaine O'Hara. And as they say in certain parts of Dublin, if he were a bar of chocolate, he'd eat himself. Delighted with himself, no problem. He's there with his, I can't remember if there's sister and or brother-in-law, but family members. And he's just getting ready for the show as if nothing has happened. But we must remember nothing has happened for Graham Dwyer. He's not remotely concerned about what's happened with Elaine O'Hara. He's murdered her. There's a query, a question mark, maybe less so now. He may have murdered other people. He certainly murdered Elaine O'Hara, but he doesn't care. So in many respects, once you get to know the minds of these people, it'd be strange if he was any other way. Because if he cared, well, I wouldn't have a slide in him, would I? Because he wouldn't be a psychopath. So that's one of the first things we look at when we're looking at the forensic psychology side of this criminology psychology debate. The other thing is sexual deviation. I'm just going to run through some topics here so you can be familiar with them. Sexual deviation and sexual offending. Offences and sex offenders, well obviously I'm not going to give you the legal side, but I have to lecture criminal law, but it's frankly about as boring as it gets, so we'll leave that aside. But certainly, as you know, there is much legislation. In Ireland, it's all over the place still to deal with sexual offences. But one thing maybe just as a takeaway from today that you might want to, if you're interested in this area and you plan on following it up, to consider is this idea of the difference between the psychological profiles of child sex offenders particularly. I mean, in a very generic sense, in psychology, we will often divide them into two groups. Paedophiles, of course, whom you will have heard of, and these men abuse solely children who are prepubescent, so for argument's sake under the age of 12. But there's another category of men called hebephiles, and hebephiles abuse only those children over the age of, for argument's sake, 12 or post-pubescent children. There is another subcategory of men who abuse 16 to 19-year-old boys and or girls, but of course they tend not to come to the attention of the authorities because, of course, they may well be dealing with people who are no longer minors but are above the age of consent. But it's important to get these two distinctions. I often say to my class when we're starting our kind of murky journey, if you like, through this area, to get the distinction between men who only abuse either side. Now, when we're looking at an offender like Jimmy Savile, of course, he is abusing, he's also an infantophile, which doesn't need any explanation. He's also prepared to abuse cadavers, so he will go across both prepubescent and post-pubescent children, and indeed adults. But the psychological profile is interesting. Those men whom only abuse, and I say only, abuse prepubescent children, in other words, their offences are all committed within that age group, tend not to be psychopathic. Now, they tend to, as you can imagine, a range of other issues that they haven't and are perhaps are incapable of dealing with, but psychopathy tends not to be there. And for those men who only abuse post-pubescent children who are hebephiles, they would almost exclusively, not always, but almost exclusively be psychopathic. And if a man abuses both strands, then he will be considered psychopathic. These are really important distinctions, not just for us here today, but obviously for researchers when they're trying to do work, because curiously enough, insofar as you have any success with child sex offenders, and it is minimal and arguably non-existent, but insofar as you do, you are more likely, evidence would seem to suggest, to have success with those men who exclusively abuse prepubescent children and those who abuse post-pubescent children, primarily because of their psychological profile. So child sex abusers, adult sex, actually, those who abuse only adults will have a different psychological profile, generally speaking, psychopathic as well, although not exclusively. And of course, there are many theories around why men do engage in such deviant sexual acts. We have time to discuss them here today. And indeed, there are various types of rapist typologies. So not all rapists are the same. They come in different manners and in different guises, but they do, of course, all have the same effect on the victim. I mean, there's no disputing that, but from a psychological perspective, it can be different. Clerical sexual offending is something we examine on this particular course that I'm not meant to be selling you here today, but I'm clearly doing. And clerical sexual offending, of course, takes us to a different level, primarily because of that reason of trust that one would have had. I do speak when I'm doing the 10-week diploma, I do talk a lot about Roman Catholic clerical sexual offending. And that's for two reasons, not because I have it in for Roman Catholics, I don't, but because most of the evidence lies within the Roman Catholic clergy, and also because less of the evidence arises amongst other faiths, although it is true to say that, of course, that abuse occurs across all denominations and all faiths. But we explore some of those myths, this idea that because somehow men are celibate, they become sex offenders. Well, I'll let you into a little secret. Never in my life have I met that going that way. What happens is sex offenders become priests, and they find a place that they have felt historically they could ply or indeed practice their trade. The fact that they may be celibate or otherwise is, I would suggest, and the evidence would suggest, erroneous, as is the nonsense that sometimes spun about homosexuality in the clergy and indeed sexual abuse of children. In fact, recent evidence seems to suggest that homosexual men who are engaged in full-time loving relationships are less likely to sexually offend against children than heterosexual men whom are supposedly in long-term loving relationships. DID and clericalism, just for a minute. So DID is dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder. Criminals the world over always love this. Now, they don't always say, John, I've got multiple personalities. You know, they give it to me, no, it wasn't me with the drink. Oh, it was something else. It was having an out-of-body experience. And some of them do have out-of-body experience. But guess what? The law isn't very friendly towards them because it's self-inflicted, because they've got high on drugs or out of their mind on cheap but strong lager. We also look at the media and the church, and this idea that somehow there appears to be, a lot of us would say, isn't that right, an elevated figure for sexual abuse within the Roman Catholic clergy, and the stats don't tell us that, doesn't show. Aggression and violence is another thing we look at. Again, this kind of crosses between criminology and forensic psychology. Jamie Bulger killers particularly, again, not too many people here remember the Jamie Bulger killing, but I won't go into it now. But certainly there's a very interesting area which is childhood violence. By childhood violence now, I don't mean like, when the sun is out getting a magnifying glass and burning a worm. I mean cutting off cats' heads and putting them on sticks. I mean unbelievable violence towards siblings and animal cruelty. Animal cruelty is known probably as one of the biggest red flags of a child. And I would say certainly if perhaps you have a niece, nephew, or indeed probably a son who might be showing signs of wanting to burn down factories on a routine basis, trying to stab their brother or sister, or trying to decapitate cats, it's probably time to give social services a call. That's not going to say that nothing can be done, but let me put it this way, the signs aren't good. So there are some early signs that are truly woefully signal what might come later on. Sometimes it's called baby psychopathy incorrectly, or properly it's called conduct disorder, which affects teenage boys particularly. Domestic violence we spent some time looking at as well in this area, of course. A couple of things to say about domestic violence. Nearly all men who abuse their wives are psychopathic or have psychopathic traits. And I'm talking about physical and or emotional abuse. Not always, but certainly would have some traits. One of the issues that I do like to discuss a little bit when I come to this area is culture seems to be very surprised that women don't leave men who inflict violence on them. Having worked with women in shelters over the years who have had to leave their husbands or partners, my surprise is not that all women don't leave their male partners, but that any of them do. And that's because they are so mentally deconstructed, emotionally, physically, financially, you name it, that it's a wonder any of them would have a wherewithal to leave. But again, that's another discussion. There are various types of aggression typologies as well, which are unrelated to psychopathy, but some people do behave in an aggressive way for other reasons. Terrorism, of course, is kind of the mode du jour. It always has been, hasn't it? And we have some of, we did have some of what were considered to be homegrown terrorists here. Of course, they were given different titles by different people. Let's not worry about that too much today. But the big issue that we cover with terrorism, I mean, it's very easy to imagine that somebody who can cut another man's head off with a penknife on a beach in northern Syria or whatever it might be has to be psychopathic. And by the way, he might be, but the likelihood is he may not be. And there are other issues at play which I think are much more interesting than good old-fashioned antisocial personality disorder. And we certainly have a look at that. And the key message there is it's psychology, not theology. We know from terrorists the world over that they tend to have a fairly poor grasp on their news peg, and the news peg is often religion, Islam, Christianity, whatever it might be. They have a poor grasp on that, but they have also equally a poor psychological grasp on everything. And it's this idea of personal significance and what we call cognitive closure. You know, if you're living in northern Syria in the desert and you haven't got a pair of shoes on your feet, and some man comes along in a tight black boiler suit and said, I can get you ladies on earth and ladies in heaven and a rocket launcher, do you know what I mean? You might weigh it up and go, well, do you know what? That's okay, that's all plus. Also, it's black and white thinking, a bit like what's going on in Britain and America at the moment. It's very attractive not to nuance anything. Just keep saying no all the time. Just keep saying no deal, you know, whatever it might be. Just keep saying the Mexicans are coming in hordes. And if you say it often enough, it'll stick with some people who either can't or won't think outside the box. Serial killers I mentioned earlier on, we have a look at those as well, of course, as distinct from spree killers, people like Anders Breivik. Serial killers are always sexual serial killers, be they overt or covert. So very often the torture, the prolonged torture, the abuse is where these men get their sexual pleasure. So it may not be overt, it could well be covert, but we know certainly that is part of it. Then we have a look at the key components of sexual serial killing to do with sadism, fetishism, and of course what we call a somatic manifestation, a bodily manifestation, which compels these men to kill. So sadly, some studies have shown that the general run of the male population can have 2 out of the 3 elements of serial killers, which is something of a worry, but what they don't have is the compulsion to kill, which is the good news. Prison's another very interesting area which we look at in criminology, a thing called the inmate code. You go up to Mountjoy tonight, I hope you won't be, but if you were to go up to Mountjoy tonight, you'd be getting some fella going, do you know the code? Do you know the code? Now, he won't know the code, but he'll talk about the code a lot, particularly in American prisons, but also in British and Irish prisons that I visited. Even there, they'll talk about the code and this idea of prison loyalty. Of course, it's always observed in the breach, but nonetheless, they talk about it. It's like a 10 commandments that they just can't keep, but they keep talking about them. So when they say be loyal to your fellow prisoners, don't snitch, of course that's exactly what they all do. But they keep talking about it as this kind of code, this bar that can never be reached. There is an inmate hierarchy in prison, of course, which is very interesting. There's a sexual pecking order from the wolves down to the punks, depending on which sort of study you're looking at, and quite a few in between. Sexual activity in prison is exaggerated by the media, without a doubt, but nonetheless it is still obviously a part of prison life. Then we have a look at, when we just finish off on prisons, very interesting idea is this U-shaped curve by Irving Goffman. The U-shaped curve is that prisoners are at their most delicate, their most fragile in the first quarter of their sentence and the last quarter of their sentence. So if you're going to see self-harm and violence, you're more likely to see it at the very beginning when they come in, which is understandable, but also towards the end, because a lot of them will have become institutionalised. Difficult in Ireland, because we don't hand out sentences that would make you become part of the institution, but roll with it for a minute. In the last quarter, they tend to get anxious and worried about coming out into the world again, and that can prove to be quite a difficult time for them as well. Mental illness and crime, a lot of misconceptions about mental illness and crime as opposed to personality disorders. True mental health illness, you might call it, illness that involves, for example, the great distinction is between DID, multiple personality disorder, and schizophrenia. Those of you who have the misfortune of knowing somebody with schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, or a variant will know that these people are essentially incapable of crime and certainly utterly unresponsible for what they might do. So it's a very different, genre to the man with the personality disorder, who makes particularly now I'm talking about psychopathy or antisocial, who makes wonderful choices for themselves, but really bad choices for everybody else. So if you're looking at somebody with schizophrenia, the tragedy of that is, of course, that they will make terrifically bad choices for themselves as well. And prisons and mental, shortest chapter ever written in a book, and unfortunately it is. Family and social correlates of crime are interesting. A couple of really big studies out there that take us down the road. The Cambridge longitudinal study being one of them. This idea that you just need your mother. Well, we can be flippant about it, but guess what you do? But there's parenting and parenting. Absent parenting is not what we're after. But parents can be absent both within and without the home. And we know the psychological effects on children is enormous, particularly the non-conclusively young boys. Young boys will then can tend to act out later on in life in a criminal perspective, provided all the other factors are coming in. They tend to externalise. Men externalise their inner anguish. That's what we do. We go to football matches, we take it out on other men, we scream, we roar, we punch, we kick. Women, on the other hand, and obviously I'm generalising here, will tend to internalise. So you will have more people up in Douglas prison tonight, and that's up now against some stiff opposition, who will have addiction issues and mental health issues than even in the main general block of the male population. And so the importance of peer relations is really important as well. I mentioned the maternal deprivation there. We're pretty certain that between the ages of 0 and 5, this tends to be a defining time for a child, and if the caregiver is absent, there's going to be some trouble later on. I'm just generalising here, obviously, during a lecture. We will talk more about it. Employment and marriage. I've never met the amount of men I meet who, can I just talk about men in prison for a minute? The amount of men I meet in prison, both in Britain and Ireland, who say that they have found, and they seem to have suddenly found, this love for their wife and children that they never seem to illustrate outside prison. But once they're in prison, I love them so much, it's not mad at them. And when they're outside prison, of course, because everybody speaks the Dublin accent on the radio, when they're outside prison, then of course they don't care about them. But suddenly in prison, they seem particularly worried about a number of issues. One of them, which is their wife's fidelity. It seems to be something they're very concerned about. And prisoners love to do nothing else than winding, heard your missus was out last night, and so they spend their whole life in prison fretting over their family, then coming back out of prison and ignoring them. I'm generalising. I'm just making general points, obviously. Not every prisoner does that. Okay, but employment and marriage is important. Guess what? If you've got a job and a wife and or a husband, life can seem a little bit better, can't it? A few quid in the pocket, as Liam Lawler said, a bit of walking around money, life can seem a little bit better. Some of you will have gone through times, you may still be going through them, where money isn't plentiful, and it is awful, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go out and commit crime, but it's not a bad start. You've got no money and somebody's got money, I'd like a little bit of that. Marriage is interesting. A lot of men talk about finding, heterosexual men, talk about finding a good woman. I'm not quite sure what a good woman is, but they talk about it. In other words, a woman who will put up with them and sort of keep them in order. And it is amazing how compliant these prisoners who are chaotic outside become in prison and seem to almost enjoy the regularity and indeed the monotony of prison life. Again, another interesting thing to talk about. in this area. Offender intelligence, there is this idea around that I've come over the years that offenders, particularly offenders who commit heinous crimes, are all geniuses. I mean, I think this it stems from the exceptions like Ted Bundy. Well, he wasn't a genius, he had a high IQ level. So what? IQ is irrelevant. IQ has been dismissed as a test in any event. EQ is what you really want to be concerned about, emotional intelligence, and frankly, if that's high, the rest tends to follow. But in any event, there is a myth about offenders being a little bit smart, and to a certain extent, they can be very survivalistic, and they know how to get out of certain situations, if I can generalize. But generally speaking, offenders' IQs, if we're going with that, which I don't, but just to let you know, is in around 7 to 10 points lower than the average IQ in the general population. So that's something that's always worth looking at, personal attributes of offenders. Then we've got these biological correlates of antisocial behaviour, and these are not fashionable, and the reason they're not fashionable is because the evidence on it is very poor. This idea of genetics and criminality. Well, we do have a number of twin and adoption studies, relatively recent and relatively large ones, particularly in the States, in Idaho and in Denmark, which suggest that there is a, well, if we can say definitive link between genetics, where twins are reared apart, one in a middle-class home, one in a criminal home, we call it, or indeed in adoption studies, where the biological parents do not bring up the child, but they are criminals. We do know we're looking at about 10 to 30% concordance rate, as it's called. That's a very interesting area. So that's why this particular course that I'm about to mention is one that combines both, and it's important to combine both the forensic side of it, the forensic psychological side of it, and indeed the criminological side of it. Conscious of time here. The social and environmental theories of crime, just briefly here. Well, of course, there are lots of social and environmental theories of crime. One of them at the end is routine activities theory. This idea that crime is incredibly boring, trust me, it is. You see fellas run up and down South Great George Street in velour tracksuits and pennies bags with 5 mobile phones. It's not that exciting, They're looking to feed their addiction for the day, and really they're not doing major heists of trains, or they're not hijacking aeroplanes. So crime is quite boring, and to the people who are committing it all the time, it's utterly mundane, and it's part of a lifestyle. And I'm not going to say a lifestyle choice intentionally, but it's certainly part of a lifestyle with which, unless you're involved in it and unless you're around it, it's very hard to understand. Okay, I'll just wrap up now. So strain, I won't go into those now. Police and interviewing techniques side, we also talk about why do police behave the way they do. That's not a criticism, by the way, it's just a question. And then measurement and distribution of crime. Well, that's got a bit of bad press recently. Let me just the last couple of slides, please, if you will. Finally, if you're interested in what you've heard today, which is just nothing, but just to give you a flavour of it, the Diploma in Criminology and Forensic Psychology, City College of Standards there. It's a 10-week course. It's running from the 26th September over 10 weeks, one evening a week online and on site, guest lectures and so on. Don't worry about that page. There's the cost, $995, 150 deposits, curious, but it's all a bit vulgar for me to talk about money. That's to the people over there. They're happy to be vulgar and talk about money in that stand. So there we go. Careers and further study talk, we give all that as well, kind of branding for life and where you should go. Any questions and answers? I know there's another lecture coming up, so maybe you want to talk to me, maybe we'll just have a chat. Thanks so much.